Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories about the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz. Our original theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. As we continue our Season 4 and our exploration of the last 50 years of Philadelphia theater history, I'm happy to bring you this interview with the longtime, and dare I say, legendary teacher, writer, and director Robert Hedley, the former chair of the theater departments of both Villanova and Temple Universities. I conducted this interview with Bob in October of 2024 in the living room of his home, the one that he shares with his wife, the theater director Harriet Power, in the lovely Philly suburb of Ballackinwood. The reason I've had to take so long getting this interview onto the podcast, however, is that during the taping, almost everything went wrong. Technically speaking, Bob was getting over a bad cold, so his voice was a bit rough. A leaf blower started up in his neighbor's yard at one point. But worst of all, my main high-quality recording device that I had set up in the room just completely failed. And when I got home afterwards, I was dismayed, to say the least, to find that there was literally nothing on it. Fortunately, however, I also had my backup device running during this interview, sitting on the coffee table, and it was just my cell phone, actually, and that had been running the whole time. Whew. However, the quality of this recording was much lower. The sound levels were inconsistent. It picked up all the times we bumped the coffee table with our feet, so there was a lot of editing work that had to be done to make this sound file usable at all. But I had had such a fascinating conversation with Bob that I didn't want to let it go to waste, so I've been doing hours and hours of painstaking sound recovery and restoration work over the past 5 months, and it is finally ready to share with you on this podcast. Though, as I have gotten this ready to share in early May of 2025, I'll note that a certain student who was also at Villanova University in the 1970s, one Robert Prevost, was just elected Pope. If I was doing this interview today, I certainly would have asked Bob Hedley if he'd ever run into this fella, Mr. Prevost, who is now Pope Leo XIV. But, well, then it's been a surprise to everyone, I guess. So how could either of us have known? But I will take it as a sign that this show was worth resurrecting, if you'll pardon the phrase. All right, here we go. Here's my interview with Robert Hedley. That you got a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Barrymores in 2008. How does that? You shrug now. You're like, because that was almost 2 decades ago. How did it feel at the time, being like Lifetime Achievement Award? I'm not done yet.
Well, I mean, it was obviously a terrific honor. I was delighted to get it, and particularly because I'd had a heart attack in 2003. I think it was, and I was hospitalized for a long time, 60 or 70 days in the hospital. So, coming out of that, like a couple of years later, getting this award, it was particularly meaningful because, quite frankly, I didn't know what I'd be doing after that. I didn't know, I lost about 50 pounds, and couldn't walk, I couldn't do anything after, and so it looked like my career in theater was over. And so it was marvelous to get it when I did, and I was particularly reminded of it recently because the two people who were most instrumental in, writing about me and nominating me for that were Lee Devon and Abby. Mm-hmm. So
who were at that time were running the People's Light Theater Company.
Yes, right. And then when, of course, Lee died recently, we went to the memorial service, and I had a lot of time to just think about what they had done for me at the time, and that was terrific. But whether I deserved it or not, I have no idea. That's not for me to figure out. But anyway, it was really meaningful at that time in my life.
Right. Well, now that we've started at a sort of significant capstone moment of the career, let's go back to the beginning. You were pointing out to me, we're here in your lovely home, you were pointing out to me a poster on your wall from the Stratford Festival in Canada, and you are originally from Canada. Where did you grow up?
I grew up around Edmonton in Alberta, and my mother had trained to be a concert pianist, and although when she emigrated to Canada, they homesteaded and they had no money and it was the Depression, but she never lost her love of performance and the theater, and so I would get to go to the movies pretty well every Saturday, and the movies in Edmonton were, they cost about 25 cents, and so I got to go regularly, and I loved that. And she always encouraged me to do theatrical things and whatever. So it's really a story of wonderful, loving parents. When I went to university, the issue at that time at the University of Alberta, you had to do one of the arts. So my mother obviously had covered the music part of it. I couldn't do that. Mm-hmm. My father was a brilliant man, although totally uneducated. He had to drop out of school to work in the mines, but he was a wonderful painter. He eventually became a photographer, and he could play a number of instruments and all that. So my sister, she was a wonderful painter. She could also play the piano. My brother, he was self-taught on the piano, but they were all artistically inclined people. And the only thing that was left for me was theater.
Oh, that was your special area that they weren't in.
It had to become that special area, and it was, and has been ever since.
So in school, you were in the school plays and things, or is that where you first started?
Yeah, and my claim to juvenile fame, I was in a play called Mother's Little Choir Boy, and I was the little choir boy. Mainly, I was involved through our church.
What denomination was it?
It was United Church. In Canada, it's not very religious. But the truth of the matter is that I also like to play basketball, and they had a very large gym.
We should stipulate for our listeners that you're a tall man like me, so you might
I wasn't tall enough, of course, and I wasn't good enough, but other than that, I loved it. And so the church combined that. It gave me a place to play ball and also to do plays, because nobody else seemed to be particularly interested in managing, directing, and all that kind of thing. It was a social church. The church was in a ghetto in Edmonton.
Ghetto? And, why do you call it a ghetto? Just a poor part of town? Or
it's the poorest part of town, yeah. And so I would deliver groceries to poor people and that sort of thing. Right. And my mother played the organ, and so it was great.
And now, I hadn't ever really clocked on that you were from Western Canada, which means that you and Bernard Havard are both from basically the same part. He's from around Calgary. I know that's not quite next to each other, but...
No.
Yeah.
Bernard, I think, was 2 years after me at the University of Alberta. I can't quite remember that, but he and I have talked about it.
Did your paths cross at all back then?
No. If we did, it would be in seeing one another's work, but... Right. I don't really recall it, but I know Bernard.
Well, how interesting that you both ended up here. That's fascinating. Yeah. It isn't a natural that part of the world to this.
One of the unsung people, is Dick Dupre, who was chair at Villanova. When I graduated from university, I took a job in Victoria, British Columbia. And Victoria, as you know, is on an island, and it was very hard to find enough activity and enough theater. So I wanted to leave Victoria, and I was very close to the president of the university for some unknown reason. And he said, "What will it take to keep you here?" And I said, the only way I'll do that is if you can pull the island closer to the mainland so I can go to Vancouver. And Dick Dupre at Villanova, when I was looking for a job, he liked the idea that I was Canadian. And Dick always thought of himself as a Canuck because he had grown up somewhere, I'm not sure where exactly, but in New England.
Okay.
And he thought of himself that way.
Stock. Yeah.
And maybe he was,
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Right.
But the only reason I ended up here was because Dick took a liking to my resume.
I see.
And brought me down to Villanova.
But before that, you were at University of Texas, isn't that right?
Yeah, I went to Texas.
Okay.
The reason I went to Texas was that the sort of stars of the department would come and teach at the Banff School of Fine Arts.
All right.
And so
The
I
Banff
would go
is
to
that famous
Banff.
sort of artistic community in the summertime in Western Canada. Yes.
Yeah, I would go to Banff in the summers. I was a student, and then I taught there. And so I would meet up with these professors from Texas.
Well, there was a lot of stuff going on in Texas in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of the regional theater movement actually began there in Houston and Dallas.
Yeah, well, Texas had money.
Yeah.
And they would hire these people who were really big-time folks.
So, is that where you got your PhD, or did you got your graduate level degree?
No, I didn't finish the PhD there.
Okay.
I did an MFA, and I did the first part of the PhD there. I took my exams there for a PhD, and I was finishing it up at NYU.
That's right. I did see that in the notes that you didn't finish it. That you did finish. I was saying. In the late 70s at NYU. Yeah. But then you say that you were recruited to come to Villanova out of there. And what was going on at Villanova? Was something happening in the theater program there that they were attempting to build or to...
Dick was a really persuasive person.
Okay.
He was a talker, and he got the Rockefeller Foundation to fund a program for playwrights. And the playwrights, David Rabe, Leslie Lee, Bill Long, Bernie DeKoven.
Did he recruit those people to come in, or was that...
Yeah, no, he recruited them.
He recruited them, yeah.
I actually started my serious career as a playwright, and I studied with E.P. Conkle at Texas and Sylvan Karshmer at Oregon, various people, and so I became interested in that. But what I figured out fairly soon was I was actually better at putting new plays on than I was in writing them. I mean, I love writing, I still write, but I had a better ability to help writers, just realizing their stuff. And so the idea that I would have these four guys, that attracted me to that. And so I went to Villanova and didn't get enough credit for it, but he was really interested in picking up top flight talent from various places, including these writers. Mm-hmm. So I thought, wow, I'd like to pigtail on this program.
So you arrived then in the Philadelphia area in 1966, is that right?
Yeah, probably 66.
It seems right.
Yeah,
because
something like that.
Yeah, the first article I could find about you, I did a little digging on my way here. The first article I could find was from February of 67, Bertolt Brecht's The Good Woman of Szechuan begins an 8-performance engagement at the Villanova Playbox.
Yes.
The production, credited to Professor Robert Hedley, will use optical projection techniques to create visual analogies between the socioeconomic plight of Shanty and the underprivileged citizens in the blighted areas of the Delaware Valley.
One of the terrific things about that production for me was exploring Philadelphia, because I went into North Philadelphia with my camera and I shot all the visuals. And I had never... I thought I knew poverty because I grew up with it, but it was an eye-opener for me.
It was a really bad time in North Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it was just absolutely awful. And I cast a black actress as Shanty. Mm-hmm. And one of the great things about Dick and about Villanova at that time was that it was very socially active, including war protests and all that. I mean,
so sort
it
of
was
progressive Catholicism of that era.
Oh, yes.
That people sort of forgotten about.
Yeah, well, I did a very large extravaganza because Villanova had a religious worldwide convention there. And so I created a script which included a lot of religious stuff, but a lot of contemporary, some Beckett. And the vice president at one point played the Antichrist. One of the major priests played Satan in another piece. I mean, it was an amazing place at that time.
Yeah. Well, then and now. I mean, the president of Villanova, Peter Donahue, right, was once the head of the theater department, right? There's always been, the theater department's been strong there for a long time, and the Augustinian clergy that's there have been very, very supportive of theater. It seems to me throughout.
Well, it certainly was. I don't know. I haven't been associated with it for a long time, but at that point it was. And I talked to these priests, really about religion and that kind of thing, because as an outsider I was interested in just what their lives were like,
right,
what they actually believed in and that kind of thing. These people were amazingly forthcoming. They were open. They were,
well, that was the time of Vatican II. It was a time when the Catholic Church was really reforming and opening and changing in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. So all that was reflected in what Villanova was doing.
And what happened in the beginning of the Philadelphia Company was that these writers from Villanova, including Leslie, they were the first people that we produced.
Right. So let's talk about that. So you got to Villanova, and there were some amazing people there. So let's talk about Leslie Lee first, who was from the area. He was from Conshohocken, right?
Yeah, well, yes.
And no?
Well, I visited his father, and at that time he was living, I believe it was in Ardmore.
Okay.
And
or
Rosemont, maybe.
Yeah.
But yes, Leslie was, we worked together for quite a long time, 10 years or more. In the first years of the Philadelphia Company, we did Leslie's plays, we did Clay Goss plays. I mean, my relationship was really close with some of those writers and actors.
Before we move on to the Philadelphia Company, which is one of the main reasons that I'm interested in talking to you today, is to talk about the other big name that you mentioned from that time, which is David Rabe, who had come. He was not a young student. He had come out of the army, right? I mean, famously, he'd already been through his service in Vietnam and was now taking up playwriting and studying it. What do you remember of meeting David Rabe? What was he like in those days?
Quiet. I'm still in touch with him. Mm-hmm. We email every month or so, nice, just to catch up with one another. What I remember best is that sometimes I would go into the bandbox, which was the theater at early years of Villanova, and I would hear this strange music, and it would be David up in the sound booth playing music and being by himself, and just he was deeply affected by his life in Vietnam, mm-hmm, and I wouldn't want to describe any particular motive for it, but he was fairly isolated, and he could really only open up to people who had been soldiers, who had been away. And I would, attempt, because we worked on a lot of shows together, mm-hmm, but I wouldn't have the same access. I was a person who just have to question him, and he would tell me as much as he wanted to tell me. He was isolated in many ways. He had been part of an ambulance unit at one point, So he'd seen really a lot of death and dismemberment, that kind of thing, and was deeply affected by it. And
well, he spent a lot of time writing about it over the next few years. His plays were about that.
Exactly. So, although we were very close as director and writer, I was never really privy to what that was like. But I know, because he would tell me where he'd been and all this, talking with people who had also been in Vietnam and were affected by it. But he was a terrific writer, and I'm reading his latest novella right now, and have been reading his recent things. I have probably all of his published work.
I should have used you, if I realized this, I should have used you as a way to talk to him before I put part of him in my recent book. He's, I talk about the play that he did with the Manning Street Company and his argument with Joe Papp that he had in the lobby of the theater, famously. But I used things that he published. He wrote about this, and he published it in a book that he wrote. So I quoted him directly. It wasn't like I didn't get his point of view, but if I'd known that I maybe could have, through you, gotten through to him on the phone, that would, I hope he doesn't mind what's in there. I tried to be respectful of all sides, because he was already branching out into the New York theater world. Joe Papp had hooked onto him kind of early, and Joe Papp was producing his plays.
Joe Papp came down to Villanova and saw what we were working on. So that connection was ongoing at the same time that he was getting things done at Villanova.
Who had gotten Joe Papp down here? Was it Dupre who had said to him, you ought to come down and see what these guys are doing? Because he was interested in finding young American writers. That was his thing at the time.
I can't remember what he came down to see, quite frankly, but it probably was The Orphan.
Okay, which they eventually did at the Manning Street Theater Company.
Which he produced. He could have been down for Sticks and Bones as well, I'm not sure. Anyway, I got to know Papp through David as well, and David hired me when he was in New York to give him notes. Maybe it was Sticks and Bones, at Lincoln Center. I did another show of his called Burning at the Public for Papp. It had a very brief run. It was an interesting play, but not particularly commercial.
Now, Joe Papp was here quite a lot. He sort of saw the possibilities of Philadelphia as a developmental area. It had been always, a tryout town, precursor to Broadway, but he saw it as a place where laboratory productions could happen before bringing things into New York. Because he brought his company down here as early as 1964. What was it like to meet Joe Papp in that era? He was getting to be kind of a big deal.
He was very good to me. He wrote a reference that got me numerous jobs because it was so overblown and very complimentary kind of thing. I didn't deserve any of it, but nonetheless, he did. And he was a real theater person. He loved the theater. I mean, he would be emotionally involved, but he was also tough. David asked me if I would come and direct a scene at Lincoln Center and show Joe what the scene could be if it were done differently. So I did, and because the production at Lincoln Center was very, kind of flash. It wasn't sort of down to earth and solid. But anyway, so I did it, and then we invited Joe in to see it, and this was with the Broadway cast.
This was Sticks and Bones?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Joe sat through it. At the end, we're all hot, and we were excited about seeing it. And Joe said to me, didn't like it. Yeah.
Wow.
And so it went back to what it was before, and I don't say it was better or anything like that, but it was just very different.
Yeah.
And that was...
But he didn't hold it. He didn't hold it against you. He just said no,
not at all.
Because then later, you got a chance to work on in the Boom Boom Room.
I'm sorry, it must have been Boom Boom.
Yeah, because that's why I was confused.
Yeah.
I remember seeing the article
it
here.
Wasn't right. That's right.
They were doing the Boom Boom Room.
Yeah.
And Rabe wasn't happy with it and wanted to see a different take on it. And you came up to help out with that. I don't have that here in my notes. Here it is. Yeah. In the Boom Boom Room, David's 1973 play about a go-go dancer in a Philadelphia nightclub. So this wasn't one of his first plays, not set in Vietnam. In fact, it was set in the Manayunk neighborhood, which is just across the river from where we are now. Opened at Lincoln Center's Beaumont Theater in New York, produced and directed by Joe Papp, and starred Madeleine Kahn, along with Julie Newmar and Robert Loggia and Charles Durning. He'd fired the original director, Julie Bavasso. Was this before or after she'd been fired?
After.
After, right.
When he took over.
Yeah, and Jeff Papp had taken over the show, right.
Right.
But the first production had been in 1972 at the Villanova University Theater Program.
Right.
And Rabe was on the faculty by then. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. I think I might have been sharing at the time.
Right. Yeah. Fellow faculty member Robert Hedley.
Film.
You hired him to teach film?
Yeah. He didn't want to teach theater. So...
Yeah, Rabe was dissatisfied with the 73 Lincoln Center production, and the following year the play was restaged downtown at the New York Shakespeare Festival's Public Theater. This time Ellen Green played Chrissy, and Robert Hedley was brought back as a director at Rabe's suggestion.
Yeah.
But it wasn't enough to impress Papp.
Well, the New York Times review, and I still remember the headline, which was "Boom Boom Room Bombs Again."
Oh no.
Yeah, they didn't like it.
Yeah.
But, first of all, it's not for everybody.
Right.
But it's done very well over the years.
Yeah, it has. And I noticed, though, that like a lot of 1970s plays, its language has started to make it unperformable. They tried to do it, I think, at Westchester University in the 80s, and that caused a big stink. And Rabe sort of said, well, my plays upset people all the time, doesn't bother me, I'm fine. But it almost was pulled because especially the use of racial epithets, which in a lot of 70s plays was just thrown around kind of loosely. By the 80s and 90s, the atmosphere had changed, and that was no longer acceptable.
When I'm talking to one of my older colleagues, we're sort of kidding each other that the things that we did during that era, I mean, we'd be arrested now.
Yeah, it just shows you how the cultural zeitgeist can shift.
Yep.
In a way that leaves the people that were there thinking they were being very cutting edge and progressive at the time, suddenly on the wrong side of history. But Philadelphia is now in a point in time when it's losing its constant flood of pre-Broadway productions for various financial reasons. Broadway was changing. And there were still some tryout towns productions coming through, but not so much. And the Theater of Living Arts had its sort of 4-year run.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. But tell me about you went to go see the shows there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? What do you remember in particular?
Oh, they would bring in major people. I mean, Diana Sands did...
She did Antigone.
Antigone, right. What was the one that was done with... Oh, there were several that were just absolutely chaotic, wonderful.
Well, there was the Becklech one. The
Becklech.
Right.
But no, there was another one.
Port Bitos, they got them into some trouble because there was bare breast in that.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. And I loved them. They were so wild. You could not imagine what was going to happen, and they were just sort of full of new kind of theatrical ideas, and it would be eye-opening. And one of the ways in which Dick Dupre was so important to me was that he was the critic for the Catholic Standard. And so he would have to go to all these shows, and he hated going by himself. So I would get dragged along
as his plus one
to all of these things, and so I got to see like everything that was going because of Dick.
Did you meet Andre Gregory, the head of the Theater of Living Arts?
I met him, but I did never hang out with him.
Oh, okay.
I met most of those people, but it was just a...
What do you remember about the sort of final crisis when he was forced to leave? What was the feeling around Philadelphia that we'd lost a great opportunity in losing him, or that just was an accident that was always waiting to happen?
You know, it was an odd little niche that there wasn't widespread sort of popular interest in theater of the living arts. People went to opening nights in order to show off their clothes, that kind of thing. I mean, I saw
to
more...
go down to South Street, which was all poverty-stricken.
Yes, and it was all very bohemian. And I remember in particular, a lot of women would come in, maybe a dress made of newspaper or something like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was fantastic opening nights.
Right.
And because of Dick,
right,
these were all opening nights.
Right.
And I was, you know, as a country boy, I was amazed by all of this. It was an education, believe me.
But then when that suddenly blew up, and the Theater of Living Arts, then it lasted another year and a half. Tom Bissinger took it over for a while, but then eventually it goes out of business in 1970.
Yes, because the repertoire was much more conservative, straightforward. I mean, these were good productions under Bissinger. They were really good. But Living Arts, it was a phenomenon. It went up with a bang. The Line of Least Existence, that big sort of thing it did with Judd Hirsch and Danny DeVito, and it was a big rock and roll thing. Again, I've written about it for the book. And I talked, Roxanne Drexler, who wrote it, is still alive, and I called her. She's in New York, and she was thrilled to hear that. She wanted to see everything I'd written about it. So when that suddenly disappeared, what was, from your vantage point out in Villanova, there's an opportunity to do something now, that there's still more of an audience for, or what was the sort of feeling in the area? Is that, well, that happened, but we can do something, we can take it a step further? I think for me, there was such a prejudice against local writers that virtually anything that was good was brought in from New York, or even if it was originated in Philadelphia, it was staffed by New York people and New York actors. Mm-hmm. And so when we started, and it's a we, believe me, when we started the Philadelphia Company, it was really about local writers trying to produce people who ought to be produced but wouldn't be because of geography.
Right. So when you say we, who was your co-founder of the Philadelphia Company?
Jean Harrison. Jean was much more important than I was. Jean, it was her idea. And she persuaded me to come on board, and Jean was an actor, had been in New York. In fact, you know those books, New Faces of every year?
Right.
Jean's in one of those.
Okay.
She was seen as one of the promising young actors in New York. Mm-hmm. Jean had a legitimate background. So she was a student. As an adult, she was a student at Villanova, and she used family money, like the money set aside for her kids' scholarships to go to university and that kind of thing. She used that to launch the company. She got her money back,
okay, good.
But nonetheless, we took turns laying each other off so we could get unemployment.
Wow.
But no, Jean was the driving force behind it.
Huh.
I was just doing the glamour stuff. I was doing directing and choosing seasons. But she was the engine that ran the place.
What was the first production you undertook? What was the beginning of what became the Philadelphia Company?
Well, theoretically, according to Philadelphia Theater Company's records, the first one was the Adding Machine, which we did at Villanova.
At the Edgar Bryce play, right?
Yeah. The lead was originally Suzanne Roberts. Suzanne fell ill on opening night, collapsed on stage, show had to stop, did not resume, was dark. The next day, maybe 2 days, Dolly Beachman took over the role. She got it up in record time.
Wow.
and then we continued that run. But that was Villanova. I think that Twelfth Night was also at Villanova originally, and then it was at Newmarket. John Arden, can't remember which of the Arden plays it was number 2 on that season. But it really wasn't until we moved. We went to the 5th floor at the Walnut.
Right. I have in here by 1976, you were working with 4 local playwrights, John Yinger, David Rabe, Pauline Jones, and Leslie Lee. We're all doing 1 act for the 2nd season of the Philadelphia Company. And you were doing it up in Theater 5 on the 5th floor of that loft building that was then, by that point, had just been connected to the old Walnut Street Theater building in the 1970 renovation. And you all, I have pictures of it because obviously a photographer showed up and you all walked over to Washington Square and took a bunch of photos together. And you were, Rabe had already written Sticks and Bones and Pavlo Hummel and the Boom Boom Room, and Lee had already written First Breeze of Summer, but you were just doing some shorter works. There's one called The Crossing and one As I Lay Dying, and and so and this tiny little theater you're working in, it's only like 50 seats, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a black box space.
Yeah.
So by 1975, there was the Philadelphia Drama Guild had become sort of the big deal nonprofit company, and it was working in the main theater downstairs at the Walnut as well as at the Zellerbach. But when you and your co-founder were starting this theater, was there some vision that maybe in the long run this will turn into something big, or you're too involved in the moment? Like, we got to get this show up. Who can think long term?
Well, the theater, it was called the Philadelphia Company. It was not called the Philadelphia Theater Company.
Right.
And the reason for that was that I said, we are going to become so well known that when you say Philadelphia Company, you know you're talking about theater. So I did not want theater in the name. Now, I don't think we ever became that, but nonetheless, it was an idea that we would take over what theater ought to be doing with local writers, and sort of proving that local writers could cut it with anyone. That's what that was about.
Did you feel you proved your point? Did you feel that by the time you ended your association with it, did you feel you'd done what you'd set out to do? Had you fostered local writers in a way that got you somewhere?
Well, maybe what I was pleased about was that more of the local theaters were doing local writers. But I was associated with John Allen and Freedom Theater. I can remember them using the Walnut at one point. It might have been Raisin in the Sun. I'm not sure.
I think
what
they
the show
Charles
was.
Fuller's play. They took a Charles Fuller play and they produced that at the Walnut.
The point I'm making here maybe is that none of the other theaters sort of became the place where black writers could hang out. And, Leslie was one writer, but Clay Goss, he was in, I think, our 2nd season or 3rd season, whatever that was. We were trying to do indigenous writers. I mean, it always struck me as so meaningful that these actors, black actors, would come into the theater and they would have stories about being hassled and being, like every day.
Right.
There would be
just coming on campus, they would get
and I remember walking down a street in Center City, and I was with 2 actors. One was Mexican, American Mexican, but the other was African American. And there I am with these 2 young women walking down. We get stopped by cops, and they say to me, "Are you all right, sir?" Because they thought I was being somehow hustled by these people.
Right.
And these were just the nicest, sweetest actors, just ordinary people. I'd like to think that we were at one of the first theaters that really did try to change what programming was like, because Philadelphia was known for its black writers.
Right. And the Freedom Theater acted as a place where they could get started. But soon, people like Charles Fuller would leave and they'd go to New York. There wasn't enough to keep them here.
Right.
Yeah.
Couldn't make a living.
No. So Leslie Lee, left for New York as well. So by the end of the 1970s, what was then as you recall it now, we're looking back a ways now, I understand. What was the general feeling that would Philadelphia ever have a indigenous theater community of its own? Did it seem likely that this was a place where nonprofit theaters and writers and actors could live and work an artistically viable life? Did that seem possible yet?
Well, we sort of prided ourselves on being a tight community. I mean, it was also the gay theater too. I mean,
we'll talk about that. When we talk about gay theater, what do you?
Well, I mean that these companies promoted, helped gay. Lenny Robertson.
Right.
Lenny, we did. I don't remember 1, 2 of his pieces. But the theater over on South Street also was doing Lenny regularly. Mm-hmm. So there was, in this period, wasn't just, people of color, but it was also...
People that are otherwise marginalized found a home base in those theater companies that were here.
And you see, we were also sort of anti-establishment insofar as we did not want to go equity. We were not equity for all of those years that I was head of it, because even though we were paying the same kind of wages that equity theaters were paying, we refused to do that. Because
are the work rules and the pension benefits?
Well, the reason was we were doing these readings. We're doing readings all the time. Mm-hmm. I mean, and the plays had maybe 15 actors. Right. Under the equity rules at the time, you couldn't do that. I mean, you would have to pay so many actors to do a reading where you were getting nothing. No, we flat out refused to do that. And so I had a lot of battles with equity at the time, because here we had really good actors in the city who wanted to work with us, wanted the salaries we were paying. Now, some of them, they did it under false names, they did all that kind of thing in order to work, because there wasn't enough work for everybody. And equity was so strident about what their rules, overall for good reasons, but nonetheless, for a company like ours, trying to do an ambitious slate of new work, and new work, please, to sell new work at the time, if it hadn't had a Broadway showing and the reviews from Broadway, you had a hell of a time getting audiences. Mm-hmm. So equity didn't understand building a community.
You did do one very ambitious production of the Twelfth Night that you'd staged before in Villanova. You staged it in the middle of Philadelphia City Hall in the courtyard. Yeah. Yeah. What was the impetus behind that? Literally in the middle of things, getting noticed? Or does it just seem like, who could not do this? What a great setting.
The second place we staged it, we staged that for 3 years, maybe, I don't know, but was at Newmarket. Do you remember when Newmarket was a glass building?
I don't. I wasn't around then.
Okay. Well, this entire glass thing that had shops and all that, and it had a reflecting pond a block north of South Street, so on Front Street.
Okay.
But Newmarket is right there, but it's the block in from Front.
Okay.
Anyway, the point was that the reflecting pond, when Orsino comes in, we had him in a rowboat come across the reflecting pond. And because the reflecting pond was 4 inches deep,
Right.
the boat had to have wheels under it. And his men walked in the water and pushed this thing across the reflecting pond, as I remember it.
Anyway.
But that was year 2, and then year 3, we started using the City Hall courtyard. Rizzo was helpful to us because Rizzo sort of liked the arts.
Did he?
Yeah, he said he did. Who knows? So we got access to that, and that would sort of be fun because the subway, there's an exit right in the middle of it all. So we were there, and, other than a few drunks yelling at the actors and all that, we got a lot of walk-up traffic, and a lot of people hung out watching these shows.
Right.
Yeah, it was great.
And was there a feeling that did you ever want to try and get a space of your own? Did you want to continue sort of being, we'll use whatever space there is in the city? There never was a thought of having your own?
We always, 313 is next to the church.
Right.
That was our
South Broad
building.
Street, near where the
we
Will
built
is.
the theater in there.
Right.
I don't know if it was 1 year or 2 years, can't remember that.
Yeah.
And then we moved to the abandoned building, which was owned by the art school. It's no longer there as well, right across the street. We were there for a year. We made a theater in there. And that was all, it was all wreckage. The theater was clean and good and fireproof and all that, but all the other rooms were full of debris, and at that time I would live there. Literally, I would have a mattress and I would live there because I had no money, nothing.
But then you leave town. Then you go up to the University of Iowa.
Yeah.
When does that start? In the early 80s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was 10 years between 80 and 90. And all of these connections eventually hook up because one of the reasons I got the Iowa job was Dave Rabe wrote a letter, and I also had Joe Papp's letter, and so that was a done deal.
So I won't dwell too much on what you did there because that's for whatever Iowa theater historian to follow up on. But Iowa has the famous writers' workshop. You're working closely with writers and developing plays there, but then by 1990, is that where you and Harriet met, by the way, in Iowa?
Yeah, we met in 87, 86.
Right.
Something like that.
So you met your wife there, and Harriet Power, the great Philadelphia director.
Well, we met at Bay Area Playwrights.
Oh, did you? Out in California?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
I went there as a guest teacher.
I see.
And she was a resident director.
I'm going to sit you two down later to a joint interview to get that whole story in. But when you and she then come back to the Philadelphia area, or I guess she's coming here for the first time, in 1990, you had been recruited then by Temple University.
They were looking for a chair. There were several people there that I knew, that I had taught, and
it had been a bit of a mess.
It was on strike. Temple was on strike.
The faculty were on strike.
Yeah, at that time.
Right.
And so when I came to interview, I met with the dean. I had to cross the picket line to even meet with the dean. The faculty was great. And all that. I knew several people and I respected them. And I had always respected Temple students. They'd been fabulous. I had hired them, as actors. And so I knew that scene pretty well. But just administratively, it was a nightmare. So anyway, with the dean's support and the faculty, that was what I chose to do. Because Iowa, I would drive from Iowa to New York to be involved in the theater scene. And to see things,
To Chicago as well, or did you generally went to New York?
Yeah, I did Chicago as well.
Sure.
But the New York was really, I had a lot of friends in New York.
Okay.
I traveled a lot there.
Well, so what was it like, so you've been away for a decade from the Philadelphia theater scene. What struck you right away? What had changed or what had not changed? What did you see? Was it encouraging? Was it seemed like the same old? What was it about?
Just to go back a little bit, you know Vicky Solot?
I don't.
Okay. Well, Vicky had been my stage manager. She came and saw the 12th night at Villanova and decided she wanted to work with our company. She became the stage manager, then the publicist and all that. So she was the one who hooked up the arts organizations so that we could have Avenue of the Arts. Avenue of the Arts was named really because she collected a lot of these organizations together.
Okay, yes, that is where I've heard of her before. I've seen those articles written about her. Yes, right.
So when I was coming back then, taking the Temple job, she organized at the Walnut a coming home party of virtually all the theater people in town who were running these small companies.
Right. So was that impressive to you? How many small companies had sprung up sort of in your absence?
How many companies there were and how much confidence these companies had in the city. And there seemed to be a whole new way of looking at talent in the city, writers in the city. It felt very different than when I had originally left.
Yeah, because Bernard had arrived in 1983 to take over the Walnut, and about that same year, the Wilma went equity and got its own theater on Sansom Street. The Philadelphia Theater Company became resident of the Plays and Players Theater, became the Philadelphia Theater Company. I'm leaving out many others, but the Arden Theater shows up in the late 1980s, and Bernard gives them eventually a space.
Yes.
And then they get a space of their own at St. Stephen's, where it's now the Lantern. By that, was Ed Rendell mayor by then? Rendell, I know, was specifically supportive of the idea that a reviving old industrial city could utilize the arts, as a sort of rallying point, economically and culturally and socially. He was supportive of that. So you felt that there was a new energy in the city.
That was tremendous.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you see, 1776, I had that celebration around 1776.
Bicentennial year, right?
Yeah, the production at the time,
right, and
the
one that was on
76.
The wall. Yeah, right.
2076. Well, whatever, and 1976.
Yeah.
I had a project, the Musical Fund Hall. Do you know anything about the Musical Fund Hall?
Yeah. Where originally the Republican Party was founded, right?
Yes.
On Locust Street, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
And where Lincoln has spoken.
Right.
So I got an architect and I traveled around to all of these small companies at that time to make a version of the Mercer Art Center. You know the Mercer Art Center? It's in New York. It was in New York.
Okay, yeah.
It collapsed.
Right, okay.
That would have several theaters and different events in each theater. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a fabulous place.
Right.
And so I got this thing and various, like, group motion dance company was one of them.
Right.
Was going to be in there.
They were in
a lineup of theaters and organizations, dance, music, whatever. And we got the promise of something like $300,000 to revitalize the Music Fund Hall.
Which at that point, now it's been converted, it's been gutted and turned into apartments. But there was a chance of it staying a performance venue?
Yes.
I see.
Yes. So I had known, just because of having to go around and try and put together all these companies,
Right.
I knew the kind of movers and shakers in the small performance
Right.
arts in the city. It was absolutely great.
Who was coming up with $300,000? Who was willing to? One song.
I have this documentation somewhere.
I'm
I
sure.
can't remember at this point.
Some
but
businessman, some wealthy person.
it was like Philadelphia 76 or something like that was what it was called, and it was a group of business people.
Right. Well, they really ran the bicentennial
Yes.
things. Yeah. It was called, yeah.
Right.
It's a chapter in my book.
So, having like grubbing around, trying to put together something, money and all that kind of thing, which eventually we couldn't get the amount of money we needed to do that. Coming back, then like 1990,
Right.
It was a revelation to me at that point, and so I felt. Going up to Temple, because Temple had always been in the far reaches, not part of Center City. It just seemed far away. That, Temple could fit in to Center City and be really, they had taken over the old
TV studio, the Mike Douglas show on Walnut Street.
Yeah, on Walnut.
Yeah.
And so we were producing there, and that we would have an ongoing presence, etc. So it all seemed like, just a big happy family at that point. So it's fabulous.
Wow. Well, let's leave it there for today. That's plenty. That was the sort of journey I wanted to catch today. Thank you to Robert Hedley for bringing us through his journey from the late 60s into the 1990s. At a later period, I promise, I'm speaking now to the recording device, not to Bob. At a later point, I'm going to sit both him and his wife, Harriet Power, down and get more of a story about what happened over the next couple of decades here in Philadelphia theater, because that's another great story. And so, Bob, thank you very much
Thank you.
This is fantastic information. So many great anecdotes and so many great leads for things that I need to go find out more about. My thanks again to Bob, and I hope I will get to interview him again later, perhaps together with Harriet, in the future. I'll remember to check to see that my main recording device is actually on, needless to say. But for our next podcast episode, we'll continue with the story of the Philadelphia Company as it becomes the Philadelphia Theater Company in the 1980s and 90s and into the 21st century. And for that purpose, we'll be talking to none other than the longtime producing artistic director of PTC, the great Sarah Goranczyk. So, if you haven't already, please remember to subscribe to the podcast on whatever app you're using to listen to the show, and please leave us a review on your app so that other folks can get to learn about our work here as we head off to another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia. Hi, folks. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast episode, you might certainly want to check out the book I wrote. It is also entitled Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia, and is published by Brookline Books, a division of Casemate Group. This book is a feast of short chapters covering every major era and major figure of theater history in the Quaker City, with lots of surprise appearances by many historical figures that you might not expect to find there. Everyone from Oscar Wilde to Muhammad Ali. Order it at your local independent bookstore, and of course it's also available at large brand name bookstore chains and at all major online booksellers. Just search for Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia. Of course, you can also literally check out this book at many local libraries. If it's not in their collection already, ask your local library to obtain a copy, and then you can read it at no charge. Or you can do what I did, buy a copy of the book and donate it to your own favorite local library so you can share the gift of fun and fascinating theater history with others. We love libraries and librarians and all they do to keep things civilized in this crazy world. In fact, on Sunday, June 29th, I will be appearing at the Brookline Books stall at the 2025 American Library Association Annual Conference and Exhibition at the Philadelphia Convention Center. If you're a librarian or a fan of libraries and are coming to the ALA, please be sure to stop by and say hello.